Hello everyone. Welcome to the online session of clinical examination for FCPS Cardiology 2020. My name is Dr. Hasib Raza and I am working as Cardiac Electrophysiology Fellow at the National Institute of Cardiovascular Diseases, Karachi. Today, the topic of our discussion is long case preparation for a case of syncope. And for this discussion, I have invited Dr. Hafiz Abdul Manan Shahid Saab. He is working as assistant professor and head of the electrophysiology department at Punjab Institute of Cardiology, Lahore. He is very well known among his students for his love for teaching and his devotion. He has spent all his time for his students, always ready to teach them, give him his precious time. So I also talked to him and invited for this webinar because I personally think that he is the best person for our participants as far as the FCPS cardiology long case of syncope is concerned. And mashallah, he is the author of two books also. One book by the name of Solved Past Papers of FCPS Cardiology, and another book in which he guides regarding the talks preparation for FCPS Cardiology. So let's talk to him. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abdul Manan साहब, कैसे हैं आप सर? आई थिंक देयर इज सम इशू सर आप अपने एंड से ओके नाउ
Yes, I did
नाउ
that. Now you are
ओके
listening, huh?
ओके सर अस्सलाम
So I,
वालेकुम मैं सुन नहीं सका वालेकुम सलाम नहीं सुन सका मैं
Walaikum Assalam. So it's highly privileged for me to discuss this very important case for my junior colleagues, and I structured in a way that it will really help you that how can you go through the exam. And I appreciate the efforts of Dr. Hasib that in this COVID pandemic, he's really doing an extraordinary job. So I think without wasting our time, we just have to proceed for our case because it's my pleasure to get maximum questions at the end. And maybe in the next 30 to 45 minutes, we will complete our presentation. So how
inshallah
you
so
see?
inshallah sir while you are setting your presentation I would just like to ask our participants, so if you have any sort of questions related to syncope, or even if you want to ask any question related to pacemakers or other devices, you are more than welcome. You know the pattern, all you have to do is to write your question in the question and answer panel, and write down your name, your institute name, and your city name. And at the end of the talk, I will take all the answers of your questions from Dr. Abdul Manan Saab. So, Dr. Abdul Manan Saab, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Uh, Whenever you are going to appear either in the long case or in the talks, then there are certain objectives, and these are the key points. Actually, I have divided my presentation in two parts. It's very hard to answer all the questions relevant to this topic. So in part one, I'll give you the history format, and then I'll discuss what are the favorite important steps in physical examination and ECG. And at the same time, what are the tips that how to fit various indications of different testing based on your special case. And then at the end, we will discuss viva questions regarding management of specific conditions. In our second webinar, I'll try my best to answer most of the questions, especially related to channelopathies, devices, and structural heart disease. I have prepared almost 20 to 25 talks stations for the second webinar, and I have made at least 40 to 50 Viva questions that will cover all your questions related to what we will left, especially in this presentation. So I have made it very structured, and I think it will really help you in the exam. So this is the case, and you will get the case like this in the exam. Here you can see that a 40 years old male, each and everything is important in this. Age is very important for risk stratification as well as the gender. So age and gender, you have to speak it loudly and clearly. It will really narrow your differential diagnosis. Then it's very important to know what's the mode of presentation, whether the patient presented in the OPD, arrhythmia clinic, or the patient presented in emergency. It will definitely give you a clue about the severity of the mechanism of underlying symptom. And second, after having one episode of transient loss of consciousness, this is the word we commonly use in our history. It's important in the way that you not only have to mention one episode, you have to get details of number of similar episodes recently or in the past. Then it's very, very important what are the circumstances when the patient developed this symptom, whether the patient developed transient loss of consciousness during standing, sitting, lying, or on exertion. And I'll discuss at the end why it's important. Again, it's very important to know the duration of transient loss of consciousness. It's very, very important to narrow your differential diagnosis. Now you can mention the pre-attack prodrome before your uh, typical attack presentation, or you can present in a way as I have mentioned. Suppose this episode was preceded by a brief period of lightheadedness, but no palpitations and prodrome. And it's very important not only mentioned the pre-attack events, events during attack, but post-attack events are very, very important in the exam. Suppose here, as I have given you the wording, when he regained consciousness, he had no nausea, diaphoresis, chest pain, or shortness of breath. He didn't got any injury, and he had no bowel or urinary incontinence. And it's very, very important sometimes to get some clues from the witness, but unfortunately you will not get any witness in the long case. But sometimes if the examiner will ask you that any question you will ask to narrow your differential diagnosis from the witness, then definitely you have to get the information as I have mentioned. Witness reported no tonic clonic movements. So now that's the second case, and you can find a presentation like this, or at least you have to mention all these wordings in your presentation. Suppose here patient came to outpatient department for evaluation of his sinus brady, as it was noted during minor surgical procedure. He reports an episode of loss of consciousness 1 week ago. After standing for a prolonged period of time, he began to feel warm, diaphoretic, and nauseated. The next thing he remembers is waking up on the floor as her wife was asking him, "Is he okay?" He was told that he was pale as a ghost and there was no incontinence or injuries. After the event, he felt fatigued but reports no other sequelae. He denies any other syncopal events. All these wordings in case 1 and case 2 are very important in all kinds of different types of syncope. So in case 3, a 35 years old healthy woman presented to the syncope and arrhythmia clinic having been referred for consultation after a spell of transient loss of consciousness. The most recent episode occurred at work. The transient loss of consciousness occurred with no apparent warning. Sometimes in the exam you have to mention the apparent warning, and sometimes you will not find it, and it has a very important clinical implication based on testing and the management. I'll discuss later. And another important wording, she reported non-specific gastrointestinal upset. Witness noted some jerky movements of her arm after her collapse and estimated that she was unresponsive for less than 1 minute. And she had sustained a minor laceration on her forehead and had lost bladder control. Sometimes we have misconceptions that tonic-clonic movements, jerky movements, head injury, and even urinary or fecal incontinence, they are not the symptoms related to neurally mediated syncope. And I'll discuss in detail at the end that you can find all these symptoms in neurally mediated syncope, and you have to keep it in your differential diagnosis. Then posture of the patient is very important. Whether the patient got transient loss of consciousness with or without prone, and in which posture, standing versus sitting versus supine. And standing and supine are very important, and as well as the exertional, just to differentiate arrhythmic versus non-arrhythmic versus neurally mediated. Now again, that's a very important point that you have to ask from the patient in the exam, whether there is any history of medications, especially antihypertensive and anti-diabetic drugs. Suppose here you have to mention like this, the patient didn't take medications, didn't use tobacco, alcohol or drugs. So worth mentioning history details. Apart from the presenting complaints and history of present illness, there are many clues in a conventional structured history format where you can get whether you are dealing with a malignant syncope or somehow low risk or benign syncope. Here some clues, some wording, especially in the past medical or surgical history. Suppose I have given you few words like, he has no significant past medical or surgical history other than obstructive sleep apnea, for which the patient was using CPAP mask. There is no history of diabetes mellitus, hypertension, smoking. It's very important to mention all these risk factors, especially you will get patients of ischemic heart disease, heart failure, ischemic or non-ischemic in the exam, and it's very important to know all these things. Again, you have to mention whether there is any history of smoking, trauma, cerebrovascular disease, congestive heart failure, non-congenital heart disease, and renal failure. Family history is very important once you are going to plan for your further testing and management. And sometimes the families are very concerned even with a single episode of syncope. He reports no family history of cardiac disease, any arrhythmia, or premature sudden cardiac death. Especially, you categorically have to ask, is there any history of sudden cardiac death, especially once the age is either below 50 or 60 like that. He did not recall any major childhood illness. He had 5 siblings and 3 children, all of whom are well. Sometimes these clues are very important, especially in syncope related to structural heart disease like HCM, ARVC, and channelopathies. Here again, it's very important, as I have mentioned over here, his uncle had died suddenly at 53 years of age without known antecedent cardiovascular disease. Actually, I have mentioned these different kinds of sentences just to give you the wording for the exam where you are really in stress. Treatment history, he takes no medications. Sometimes you have to categorically mention especially if there is history of diabetes mellitus or hypertension, what kind of medications the patient is having, or if there is no history of any kind of medication related to syncope. Occupational history is very, very important. High risk occupations, the history of high risk occupation will change your management strategy as well as the testing approach. So, in summary, what are the objectives of history taking in exam? It's not simple here. You just have to take 10 to 15 minutes and to take history randomly. You should have some aim at the end to summarize all the history points and to keep your differential diagnosis within 2 to 3 lines, rather than to keep your differential diagnosis uh, where you are unable to differentiate cardiac versus non-cardiac or other kinds of syncope. It's very, very important. So diagnosis, grip on relevant terms and definitions, and these all are mentioned in your guidelines. Especially you have to differentiate syncope from pre-syncope, what's the definition of transient loss of consciousness, and at the same time various kinds of neurally mediated syncope, orthostatic hypotension, all these things you should have grip on all those terms and definitions, and it will really help you once you are taking the history in the exam. Exclude distractors. You know that you will not get the patients from the neurology unit like epilepsy, but at the same time you have to keep your differential diagnosis very open, and you have to exclude all those kinds of distractors. And very, very important to dig out what's the possible mechanism and what are the reversible factors in your history. And at the end, you have to risk stratify based on your history and sometimes examination, ECG and echo, because it has an implication on the prognosis. And then you have to decide in your history whether what's the mode of how will you disposition your patient, whether you will manage your patient in the emergency, you will just admit, or you will keep your patient in structured emergency department for next 72 hours for further workup, or you will keep your patient in your through your OPT. So it's very, very important in the history that you have to risk stratify, and you have to decide the mode of management. And at the same time, it's very important to know the comorbidities and patient and family expectations. Don't ignore. You have to build the history rather than you will start taking the history based on your mind. You have to keep the things open. Guide about the focused workup. These all are the key objectives of history taking in the exam. Then, what are the aims once you will go for examination? In the exam, you will get cases, especially device cases and structural heart diseases cases like mitral valve disease, aortic valve disease, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, ischemic and non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, myocardial infarction. It means that most of the time people will tell you that the examination of the syncope is normal. It's not like that. Diagnosis and prognosis based on the underlying structural heart disease and the history of device implantation. So suppose after taking the vitals, you have to concentrate on the blood pressure, and you have to show to the examiner that you are taking the blood pressure based on the protocol, especially lying or sitting, and then immediate and after 3 minutes standing. A relevant focused physical examination, especially to look for stigmas of major risk factors and signs of heart failure, signs of atherosclerosis, and signs of coronary artery disease, is very, very important. Detailed cardiovascular examination, especially you have to use your format like inspection, palpation, and auscultation, both in device cases and structural heart disease cases and congenital heart disease cases. where you have to exclude valvular lesions, heart failures, evidence of any cardiac procedure, especially device implantation, very, very important. And then the second important examination is the central nervous system examination, where you have to exclude your differential diagnosis and you have to look for signs of atherosclerosis. Especially, you have to show the examiner that you are looking for sensory and motor systems, respiratory system and gastrointestinal system. You can keep it very brief. Uh, Sometimes they will ask you what blood testing you will do. I think it's relevant once they will give you the long case of ischemic heart disease and the heart failure. Generally, you can say that complete blood count, especially in the history of gastrointestinal bleed. I don't know they will give you such case in the exam. And renal failure, relevant. Blood sugar level, definitely relevant. And then for structural heart disease, heart failure, and ischemic heart disease, you can ask about the troponins, pro-BNP, especially once they will give you a case of classical acute myocardial infarction or ischemic heart disease. Now, it's the trick. Suppose if you are very good in taking history, examination, and again you are very good in interpretation of ECG, it means you have completed your initial evaluation. If your approach is very structured, very systematic, and you are very good in interpretation of ECG, it means that you have done your job. You have cleared your long case, but it should be systematic. And you have to describe your ECG based on your history and physical examination findings. Definitely, you will not get the normal ECG in the exam. But even if you have a normal ECG, maybe after any event that's hidden from you in the exam, you have to describe that in a very, very systematic way. Suppose you have to see the height of P wave, what's the interval of the PR, and what's about the QRS width. Is there any evidence of interventricular conduction delay, right or left bundle branch block? What's about the QT interval? What's about the ST wave changes? So if you use this systematic approach, you will not miss even a single thing. Suppose here, as I have shown you, that there is clear evidence of pre-excitation. And again, you have a wide complex tachycardia. Unfortunately, I have stretched this image. This is a classical case where there were all the findings suggestive of ventricular tachycardia as an underlying etiology of this wide complex beats. Here you can appreciate the captured beats and the wide complex tachycardia. It's hard to appreciate the VA dissociation, but there were. Again, you can find the ECG like this, especially in the talks, and you should have a clear description of this, whether there is an evidence of pre-excitation in the background of atrial fibrillation, pre-excited atrial fibrillation. And sometimes the examiner will ask you, what will you look for ECG without showing you the ECG? Then you have to divide the ECG in three sections. Whether you are looking for channelopathies, whether you are looking for arrhythmias, maybe brady and tachy, and whether you are looking for evidence of structural heart disease like old infarction, evidence of chamber enlargement. Here again, you can appreciate that the patient is having high-grade AV block, and at the bottom strip, you can appreciate that the patient is having evidence of oversensing, failure to capture, undersensing, because here the device fails to sense the preceding normal QRS, and then it happens once the cardiac cycle was in a vulnerable period and the patient developed polymorphity. So you have to keep great grip, especially in interpretation of ECG, whether the examiner will show you the ECG or not. You have to look it in a systematic fashion. Echocardiography, it's very, very important. once you have completed your initial evaluation that includes history, examination, and ECG. Here again, the objective of echocardiography is to differentiate normal versus abnormal heart, structurally abnormal heart versus structurally normal heart. Especially in the exam, it's relevant to look for regional valve motion abnormality, chambers enlargement, and evidence of LV dysfunction and RV dysfunction. In echocardiography, most of the time, uh, uh, especially they will ask you that the patient is having structural heart disease and the echocardiography is normal. Uh, there are few cases, especially arrhythmogenic RV dysplasia, they are oftenly missed in the echocardiography. So right heart especially ignored in the echocardiography evaluation, and it's very, very important to know that how to look for, especially once the ECG is suggestive of arrhythmogenic RV cardiomyopathy. So echocardiography has a class 2A recommendation, and you have to answer in a way that you have to differential, that you have to exclude the structural heart disease. Uh, you have to enlist all the possible causes of cardiac syncope. Once the examiner will ask you that what will you look for in the echocardiography, especially the transthoracic echocardiography. Now, it's very, very important step, and it's oftenly ignored in the exam. That would directly jump to the investigations, that you directly jump to the management, and you often ignore this risk stratification. It's very, very important in the exam if you really want to get good marks. So the history, examination, ECG, and echocardiography will help you that how can you risk stratify your patient. Suppose in the exam, this is the key that you have to exclude serious medical conditions that demand hospitalizations. And then definitely they will give you the cases like this. They will ask you, suppose low risk patients like vasovagal syncope in the viva. But in the long case, they will give you those cases where there is definite diagnosis based on history, examination, ECG, and echocardiography. Then it will really help you to quickly risk stratify your patients. Suppose I have divided serious medical conditions regarding risk stratifications into three arms: cardiac arrhythmic conditions, non-arrhythmic conditions, cardiac or vascular, and non-cardiac conditions. Again, you have to answer the examiner that what are the clues in your history, echocardiography, ECG, and others that are helping you to risk stratify. Suppose aortic and mitral valve disease, history of acute myocardial infarction, they all are the clues. In your physical examination and history, ECG again will help you whether there is any evidence of conduction disturbances or acute or old infarction. Non-arrhythmic conditions, cardiac or vascular, like valvular heart lesions, and pulmonary embolism, pulmonary hypertension, and all those things. So you have to answer the questions just by formulating in history, examination, ECG, and echo, rather than to say haphazardly that these are the high risk medical conditions. So it will give you a very good impression on the examiner that your approach is very systematic, and at the same time you are not losing important diagnostic clues, as you have earlier mentioned in your ECG examination, ECG and echocardiography. You are taking all those points in your diagnosis as well as in your differential diagnosis. Then again, it's a very, very favorite question for the examiner, that define intermediate risk patients and how will you dispose them. So again, history and physical examination, If the patient's age is more than 50, as I earlier mentioned in the start, never ignore age and gender. Very, very important. Symptoms not consistent with neurally mediated kinds of syncopal syndromes. History of structural heart disease, suppose in the ECG, you are having evidence of Q waves, or in the history and physical examination, the patient will give you that there was a history of old infarction. But at this moment, there are no signs of active consequences of that disease. It's very, very important. Family history of early sudden cardiac death, history of cardiac devices without evidence of dysfunction. It's important. Physician's judgment that the syncope is cardiac. Again, it depends on the experience. Biochemical findings, ECG and chest X-ray, especially in ECG, evidence of conduction disturbances, right bundle branch block, trifascicular block, left bundle branch block, loss of R wave in precardial leads, evidence of old infarction like Q waves, evidence of left ventricular hypertrophy. Very, very important. Low risk patients, especially by definition, neurally mediated reflex or orthostatic cause, where there is a definite a reversible way where you can use different treatment strategies, especially education and counseling, rather than to go for hi-fi testing, is a relatively low risk patient, and you can keep such patients through your OPD. Concealed channelopathy is definitely they will not ask you, but it's very, very important in rare differential diagnosis where you will find normal physical examination, no clues in the ECG, and echo is absolutely normal. It's actually a trick where you have to keep it in your differential diagnosis. If the examiner will ask you that all those things are normal, and still you can think that the patient is having uh, syncope related to channelopathies, yes, suppose concealed long QT syndrome and Brugada syndrome like causes. Cardiovascular testing, very, very important, and the aim is just to exclude structural heart disease. Most of the time, you will get all your answers in your echocardiography, but sometimes, especially in concealed ARBC or infiltrative disorders, you have to use other modalities, and sometimes you have to use neurological imaging if the syncope is not a classical cardiac, or it's somehow you are confused between seizures and the syncope. Stress testing, it's very, very important, especially post MI cases where they will ask you, especially the risk stratification. You have to know class 1 recommendations in a patient who is undergoing stress testing. But honestly speaking, in my experience, if the patient presents only with syncope without any preceding history of palpitation, chest pain, dyspnea, and at the end I'll discuss one scenario, then it's very, very unlikely that you will add any something more by doing exercise stress testing. So you have to know the clear indications of doing exercise stress testing. Cardiac monitoring, very, very favorite question, and how to answer this is important. Suppose this is the question from the examiner: which monitoring system will you use for your patient? With justification. It's not a single line answer, and you don't have to answer just by saying that I'll do this stress testing. Don't do like this. So you have to answer like this: I have given you the wording. Sir, it depends on the frequency and severity of syncope. It depends on the duration of prodrome and the what kinds of symptoms the patient might have before attack, and suddenness of incapacitations. If there is no prodrome, then those tests, especially which are patient triggered, then definitely you will not select those tests. So it's very, very important to answer like this in the exam. What's the frequency and what's the suddenness of loss of consciousness? It's very, very important. And types of cardiac rhythm monitors with devices description and patient selection. I'll not go in details because it's mentioned in details in your guidelines of syncope. But here you have to answer like this, whether you have to choose your rhythm monitors uh, between the three things, continuous versus intermittent monitoring, patient is able to activate, or you are dealing with auto-triggered cardiac rhythm monitors, and non-invasive or versus invasive, especially implantable loop recorder, whether where you are dealing with unexplained, uh, infrequent syncope, where you will get all the other rhythm monitoring tools normal, like Holter monitors, event recorders, external loop recorders, and even the other kinds of devices which will really will not help you to clearly correlate between symptom and the rhythm. That's our objective, especially once we are taking the history of syncope. So again, uh, they can ask you the questions regarding evaluation of ambulatory patients. Then what are the guidelines for cardiac monitoring? What are the types of cardiac rhythm monitors with regard to patient data? Now, now again, it's a very, very favorite question. And would deliberately do not ask, we almost, you can say, exclude neurally mediated syncope once we will not find these things in our history, but it's not the truth. These are the misconceptions. Suppose vasovagal syncope is possible in elderly patients. It's possible without any prodrome. It's possible during driving. The patient can sustain severe injuries and the underlying etiology is neurally mediated syncope. And it's very, very tricky. Suppose if the patient will ask you that he or she is having history of myoclonic jerks and tonic-clonic fits, then you will ask that the answer is seers are like that. It's not like that. If the patient develops tonic-clonic fits immediately after transient loss of consciousness, and if they resolve within in less than 10 seconds, then you may have vasovagal syncope or cardiac syncope without epileptic fits. It's very, very important. Urinary or fecal incontinence are not pathognomonic for seizures. They can be seen in vasovagal syncope and cardiac syncope. We have many patients in our experience where the neurologists are dealing all those patients on anti-epileptic treatments, but at the end, all of a sudden, they come to know that the underlying etiology was idiopathic paroxysmal AV block, or sometimes the things like that, which really have a definite management step. So it's very, very important to know all these kinds of misconceptions, and they will help you to convince your examiner that all these things are possible in vasovagal syncope, and it will give you a very good impression. Now, this mechanism is known to all, but why I put this slide in this presentation, because exact mechanism of vasovagal syncope is not known. There are three hypotheses. I'll not go in details, uh, as I have to mention the exam structured syncope case, but in the exam you will never say that this is the mechanism of vasovagal syncope. All these are hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, 2, and 3. Suppose if the patient is having fear and stress, or the patient is having pooling of blood in his or her lower legs, then definitely there will be decreased blood volume in the bottom chambers of the heart. Especially there are mechanoreceptors in the infralateral left ventricle, and then there is vagal efferents, and there is a special uh, system in the midbrain where uh, you will get the sympathetic efferents and vagal efferents, just to give you the concept of bradycardia and hypertension. But the aim, the objective of showing this slide, just to say that there are different hypotheses rather than the definite mechanism of vasovagal syncope that's not known. Actually, I am mentioning in details, or you can say next 2 to 3 slides, of vasovagal syncope, because we are having referral of vasovagal syncope from cardiologists, and they are your examiners. So they know that you have a very good grip on cardiac syncope, but they want to learn, they want to share their experience regarding vasovagal syncope. So if you are confused in this common type of syncope, it will not give you a good impression on the examiners. So again, in the exam, you should have a clear concept that if the examiner will ask you that where will you go for head up tilt table test, you have to give clear indications. Most of the time I heard from the junior colleagues that they ask that they will go for head up tilt table test once the diagnosis is vasovagal syncope. Please don't do this, especially don't answer like this in the exam. It's very, very important to know the class of recommendations of tilt table testing. I'll make it very simple for you. Suppose here I have mentioned that the diagnosis is reflex syncope, but you are not sure. There is no prodrome. The patient sustained injury. And sometimes, as I earlier mentioned, that the patient is on anti-epileptic treatment and the patient is not responding, and we are going for head up tilt table test, and all in sudden we come to know that it's an atypical reflex mechanism. So again, it's very, very important to discriminate convulsive syncope from epilepsy, syncope with injury and occupational considerations, very important. Frequent syncope with suspected psychiatric origin. Suppose during head up tilt table test, you are monitoring the rhythm, you are monitoring the blood pressure. If all in sudden the patient develops the symptoms and ECG is normal, heart rate is normal, blood pressure is normal, definitely you will say that the patient is having pseudosyncope. So it's again very, very important. Interpretation of test is very, very important. So distinguish syncope from falls in the elderly, and discriminate neurally mediated syncope from delayed orthostatic hypotension. Again, the definition of early orthostatic hypotension, as I earlier mentioned in the beginning, terms and conditions, and delayed orthostatic hypotension. After 3 minutes, within 15 seconds, how much time you have to keep your patient in a standing posture, very, very important. Now, you should have a clear wording about the interpretation of tilt table testing results. Suppose type 1 mixed, where you have both responses, cardioinhibitory and vasodepressor. In type 1 mixed, heart rate falls at the time of syncope, but the ventricular rate doesn't fall to less than 40 beats per minute, or falls to less than 40 beats per minute for less than 10 seconds, with or without a systole of less than 3 seconds. Blood pressure falls before heart rate falls. Type 2A and type 2B, cardio inhibition with and without a systole, very, very important regarding the treatment strategy for vasovagal syncope. Without asystole, cardio inhibition, heart rate falls to a ventricular rate less than 40 beats per minute, but for more than 10 seconds, differentiating points from the type 1 mixed. But a pause of more than 3 seconds, doesn't occur. Blood pressure falls before the heart rate falls. Type 2, cardio inhibition with asystole. A pause occurs for more than 3 seconds. Blood pressure fall coincides with or occurs before the heart rate falls. Type 3, vasodepressor. Heart rate doesn't fall more than 10% from its peak at the time of syncope. So these interpretation of tilt table testing is important once you will go for management strategy. So it's again a favorite question of the examiner. What's the role of beta blockers in the neurally mediated syncope? No role. Possible benefit to B recommendations in those patients whose age is more than 40 or 42. Yes, pacemaker therapy. Yes. Here, it's a very, very important trial, issue 3 trial. Here you can see that those patients who are having cardio inhibitory response with a pause of more than 3 seconds, syncope, then there is a role of permanent pacemaker implantation. But at the same time, if the patient is having vasodepressor response on head tilt table test and you are going for permanent pacemaker implantation, then you have to answer your patient that you might not be benefited from this device. Yes, if the head-up tilt table test is negative for vasodepressor response and the patient is having pure cardio inhibitory response with asystole, then these are the kinds of patients where you have to answer in the exam that they will get the benefit from the permanent pacemaker implantation. And I think I left with a few slides because it's my pleasure to get maximum questions from all of you, that how can I help you in the exam, which I left especially in the history examination, ECG, echo, monitoring, and somehow in the commonly asked vasovagal syncope. In the exam, you have to differentiate idiopathic proximal or simple secondary proximal AV block from neurally mediated kind of asystole or pause. If there is sinus slowing, if there is an evidence of sinus brady along with AV block and the patient is having sinus arrest, then it means that the pause you are having in any kind of your monitoring tool, that may be the 24-hour Holter. Here I have mentioned implantable loop catheter. If there is sinus slowing, if there is an evidence of AV block along with significant pauses, then the underlying mechanism is neurally mediated. And in if the patient is having paroxysmal AV block or high grade AV block, then you will not find sinus brady like that. Especially in idiopathic paroxysmal AV block, it's like a switch on and off. The patient will develop syncope and all in sudden the patient is absolutely normal. And you will get this kind of tracing, especially on your different rhythm monitoring tools. So it's important to know the difference between vasovagal mediated pauses and idiopathic paroxysmal AV block. And this concept, this knowledge will help you in your practical practice as well. Now, this slide is important for your review. I heard from my juniors that neurally mediated neuroendocrine means only vasovagal syncope. Here you can see carotid sinus related syncope, carotid sinus hypersensitivity, situational. These all are neuroendocrine, neurally mediated, rather than only vasovagal. So you should have a clear answer, clear concept what's meant by that. And definitely, it's very, very important to differentiate these two entities. And here they will assess your knowledge regarding the interpretation of head-up tilt table testing results. Cardiac arrhythmia, definitely, it constitutes 10%, and you will get these two cases, these two causes in the exam. And it's a favorite Viva question, especially neuroendocrine. So at the end, I have a very, very practical scenario for all of you. 52 years old male with history of syncope and head laceration. He is on dual antiplatelet angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors treatment and statins. Echo revealed ejection fraction of 50%. Coronary angiography revealed chronic left anterior descending occlusion. Now the choices are, and you will find this kind of ECG in your exam. Again, you have to interpret this ECG in a very, very systematic fashion. By this, you will not miss even a single thing. PR interval, shape of P wave, evidence of Q wave, whether there is an evidence of conduction disturbances, right bundle or left bundle. What's about the evidence of left ventricular hypertrophy, T wave inversions, where the Q wave, what's the loss of R wave. All those things are important in interpretation of this ECG. So here are the choices. In this patient, in this scenario, in this background, and with this knowledge, what's your choice of management? What's your choice of testing strategy? Whether you will go for stress testing like myocardial perfusion imaging, whether you will directly go for PCI, or you will plan for electrophysiological testing, or you will go for any kind of rhythm monitoring tools. So it's very, very important. So here, if the patient is having clear indication of ICD, especially in primary prevention, then there is no role of going for implantable loop recorder or electrophysiological study. Here the ejection fraction is more than the what's the mentioned in the guidelines, 50%. And second, as I earlier mentioned, if the patient purely presents with syncope and with this kind of ECG, with no history of exertional chest pain, shortness of breath, preceded palpitation or like this, then it's mentioned in the literature, you will not get anything special in your workup, in your management. Even after doing the revascularization, the patient's syncope will not settle down. So here it's very, very important that the diagnosis of syncope is different from the prognosis of syncope. Here, suppose the patient might have underlying advanced AV blocks and you are going for electrophysiological study, and definitely you will go for permanent pacemaker implantation. But this management strategy have no impact on the prognosis. The prognosis depends on the underlying disease progression of this patient. Suppose if this patient, as this patient is having myocardial infarction, there is an evidence of Qs in the anterior leads. Prognosis depends on the progression of the underlying disease, while the management, while the diagnosis, while the choice of testing depends on the clinical history, examination, your ECG, and the data you have from rhythm monitoring. So in the exam, never confuse the diagnosis from the prognosis. And you have to keep all your guidelines, recommendations clearly in your mind, especially once they will ask you what are the indication of electrophysiological study. So in summary, in the exam, you have to pay attention. You have to get detailed history. Details, details, details. Look for key features in the history, examination, and tests. You have to risk stratify your patient. It's very, very important for the management, and it has a very, very good impact on the examiners. The risk factors will lead to the appropriate decision for further testing. Unexplained syncope needs attention. No guidelines for rhythm monitoring, head up tilt table test, and electrophysiological study. Know the interpretation of testing. Clear interpretation, no ambiguity, clear concepts, and especially neurally mediated syncope in details and vasovagal syncope especially. Thank you very much.
Thank you
It's
so
over to
much.
Dr. Asif.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manan. What a wonderful presentation. I must appreciate you, and I must also congratulate you. All the essential points have been covered. You take the history, you talk about investigation, you start from ECG, go through echo, talk about the recorders, and all the main questions most of the time asked by the CPSP examiners regarding the tilt table and the other things have been discussed. I think there is nothing left to question, Dr. Manan. There is nothing left to question. So I'm very, very thankful to you. Even I learned a lot of things today from you. So it was a learning session for me as well. So let me take a look at the question and answer panel. If I have some questions, I am definitely going to ask from you. Okay, so Dr. Awais हैं जी हमारे साथ. Dr. Awais is asking, for orthostatic hypotension, we need to take one lying blood pressure while second blood pressure immediately on standing or after 3 minutes of standing. Please.
Yes, the objective of taking blood pressure in lying and a standing posture just to exclude two important things. Whether you are dealing with early orthostatic hypotension or delayed orthostatic hypotension. Whatever the step you will adopt in your exam, you should have a logic behind that. Okay, suppose if there is immediate drop of blood pressure, and then it means that you are dealing with a early orthostatic hypotension. And if there is if the patient is having underlying delayed orthostatic hypotension, then definitely you have to wait for 3 minutes. Then the patient will have persistent hypotension after standing posture for 3 minutes or more than that. So you should have a reason why it's important to know the blood pressure immediately after in a standing posture and after 3 minutes. So what's your input in this regard, Dr. Hasib?
Sir, I'm going to take two more questions, and I think we can answer them together because
Why not? Why not?
the next two questions are also related to this thing, the standing blood pressure and the lying. I think they are confused. Let me put the question. Dr. Fazal Rahman, Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Fazal from NICUD Karachi. How to take blood pressure at sitting and then at standing? Question mark. Practical steps. How to differentiate autonomic instability or cardiac disease on fall in blood pressure during standing. Please clear the concept. And next question, how can we wait for 3 minutes to check his blood pressure while standing when we do not have time? We have to save time.
Sir, you have ample time in syncope, don't you worry about. Okay. So again, in the exam, you have three kinds of patients, especially diabetic with ischemic heart disease, and sometimes aortic stenosis, and rarely conduction, especially permanent pacemaker implantation. This is true especially for those patients who are having history of secondary autonomic dysfunction. So if suppose there is a clear-cut history of valvular aortic stenosis, then there is no fun to do this thing. And sometimes you can ask the examiner that the patient will not tolerate this maneuver. But if your long case is having a risk factor of diabetes mellitus and ischemic heart disease and syncope and heart failure, then definitely you have to follow this protocol. the practical steps are already mentioned in the guidelines, that you have to inflate the, definitely you have to use the cuff, you have to inflate the cuff per protocol, and you just have to ask your patient that what you are going to do in the next 2 to 3 minutes, and at the same time you should have some support for the patient. But sometimes the candidates ask me that it's not important to do a fundoscope in the exam, and I remembered that after 1 year back or 2 year back, that most of the examiners were very keen to see the candidates that whether they are going for fundoscope or not, like that. You have to do this, especially if there is history of diabetes mellitus in your long case. I don't think so. You can skip this detailed step in your long case. There is no justification. As far as the protocol is concerned, I can share you the pictures in WhatsApp group, that what are the protocols where you have to use those practical steps for this.
I agree with you, Dr. Manan. What you can do within the 3 minutes, so you check the blood pressure in the lying position, and now you make the patient stand up. Now, what you can do, you can check the height of the patient, you can check the girth of the patient, calculate the BMI of the patient, and meanwhile, you can do the fundoscopy of the patient. All these things will take at least 2 to 3 minutes. And after completing these steps, you can check the standing blood pressure, and then you can make the patient walk or whatever you want to do. This was one thing that we used to do in order to consume these
Agreed,
3 minutes.
but agreed. You can use, but truly speaking, in the guidelines, you just have to focus on your blood pressure maneuver rather than to use that time for other things. Maybe it will give a bad impression on the examiner. Most of the time, the examiner will ask you whether you will go for a standing blood pressure, and they just want to ask yes or no. So don't be confused that you don't have a time, or they will give you truly 3 minutes. But you have to follow the protocol. Maybe after 30 seconds, the examiner will ask you, okay, it's good.
Yeah, okay. I think we have to differentiate this. If we are going for a long case of syncope that we are discussing, I think it is not necessary to go for height and girth and all those things. But if the case is of ischemia, and there you also go for blood pressure or static hypertension things, then BMI has its own role, and it is related to ischemia. I think you can do these steps
Yes.
in the long case of ischemia.
Good.
Okay, so we have a next question is from an anonymous attendee. Tell me, sir, time period of post MI patient permanent pacemaker implantation. I think you got the question.
Very, very good. It's a very, very practical question. And my answer is that there is no single line answer, and you have to answer as I am answering you at this moment. It all depends on the speed of revascularization. Suppose if the patient landed in emergency with acute ST elevation myocardial infarction secondary to blockage in the proximal LAT, and you did primary PCI within 1 hour, and at the same time the patient is in blocks, at the same time another patient with inferior valve myocardial infarction, and you did revascularization after 2 days, then definitely the answer will not be the same for these two patients. So it again depends on two things. What's the speed of revascularization, and what kind of conduction disturbances the patient might have. Suppose if the patient is having 2 to 1 AV block in the background of inferior valve myocardial infarction, and you are going to revascularization in next few hours, then you have to wait for next 5 to 7 days. And in our experience, we have seen that these are the quick recoverers. And second, if the patient develops complete heart block in the background of anterior valve myocardial infarction with right or left bundle branch block, whatever the mode of revascularization you will use, maybe you will wait for next 3 to 5 days, and you have to go for permanent pacemaker implantation. But after knowing the coronary anatomy and knowing the kind of revascularization, sometimes the patient might have a surgical disease in the background, and you are asking, and you are giving your answer to the examiner that you will go for permanent pacemaker implantation. So you have to answer like this. Number one, sir, it depends on the type of myocardial infarction, number one. Number two, what kind of underlying conduction disturbances the patient might have. Number two, what kind of revascularization the patient received, whether through pharmacological or through percutaneous or through surgical, and what's the time frame. And second, in monitoring uh, time, what the response, what kind of the symptoms the patient develop. This is the way you have to answer the question in the exam, rather than to say 7 days for inferior valve myocardial infarction and no time for anterior valve myocardial infarction. I don't think so. It's a practical and it's a good answer.
Okay, great. Dr. Nagina from Rawalpindi Institute of Cardiology. Please mention commonly asked long case questions in ARVC. Sir, usually, do they usually select such patients ARVC?
Okay. As far as now, most of the colleagues have cleared the theory section of the exam. Now they have to appear in the talks and in the long case. The ARVC is commonly asked in the talks. They will give you the ECG. They will give you an ECG, normal ECG of 12 lead ECG of ARVC, and they will check you whether you are picking up the depolarization and repolarization abnormalities. Then they will give you the ventricular tachycardia ECG, and they will assess your knowledge whether you are able to differentiate RVOT, normal heart VT, from ARVC VT. There are certain definitely clues. And then they will assess your knowledge in echocardiography and cardiac CT and sometimes cardiac MRI. And they will give you some imaging studies, whether you are able to pick the device therapy in the background of which kind of substrate the patient might have. I think, I don't know that they will ask you ARVC in the long case, but it's good to know ARVC and hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy in detail for talks and for short cases.
Okay. And Dr. Nagina has also another question. Do we need to study all pacemaker and ICD settings and device interrogation parameters for long case viva?
I have a very good presentation that's a very structured at what are the 20 to 30 questions you should know with detailed mechanisms about the device interpretation for the exam. In the exam, they will not spare you if you are not clear about the indications of device therapy. They will not spare you. Second, uh, especially as far as the talks is concerned, as far as the long case is concerned, they will ask you about the pre-procedure, per-procedure, and post-procedure of permanent pacemaker implantation. They will ask you some questions about the follow-up, and they will give you some ECGs or some questions based on the troubleshootings of single chamber permanent pacemaker implantation, both VVI and AI, dual chamber permanent pacemaker implantation, especially their modes, and the favorite 4 to 5 troubleshootings of each device therapy. And very important for the long case, detailed and systematic approach of chest X-ray interpretation of permanent pacemaker implantation case.
Great, great. Our next question is from Dr. Mohammad Abaidul Haq. Sir, what are the steps of examining the pacemaker site during examination?
Very good. It's actually a part of cardiovascular system. As I earlier mentioned, that you will not skip the inspection. Definitely, there is no need to go for palpation and auscultation. In inspection, the aim of device implantation case is to look for, especially, what the site is there any evidence of infection or inflammation near or close to the site of implantation, and what's the look of incisional site, and sometimes the size of the device will help you to know whether you are having uh, ICD, CRT-D, or permanent pacemaker. So there are some clues on the inspection of the cardiovascular examination, but you just have to focus on that part to exclude signs of infection rather than to go for palpation and to do Tuederer syndrome.
Great, great.
No manipulation.
Okay, okay. Another question from Rahul Pindi. We have how to differentiate vasovagal from epilepsy if fits and incontinence can happen in vasovagal also.
Very, very good question. Uh, in the literature, they have mentioned that if the patient developed transient loss of consciousness and the patient is having tonic-clonic fits, but they lost for only 10 seconds after transient loss of consciousness, and then it means that the patient is having, maybe having vasovagal or neurally mediated syncope. In a patient who is having a seizure, then the patient will develop tonic-clonic fits after transient loss of consciousness for more than 10 seconds. And they have a classical, you can say, pattern where you can differentiate epileptic versus non-epileptic fits.
Great, great, great. So our next question is from Dr. Fahimul Hassan. At what point in the examination you recommend we should check blood pressure of that patient? At the end or during the general physical examination?
I think you have to follow your systematic approach. You have to make a format of long case of syncope. I prefer that after completion of history, especially, and once you are going for physical examination, there is no need to confuse uh, uh, the taking the pulse from the blood pressure. Pulse, JVP, detailed cardiovascular examination, and neurological examination. And at the end, once you have completed your all physical and systemic examination, you can go for this blood pressure monitoring rather than right from the start. You will go for sittings and standing blood pressure. You can modify your examination.
Okay. So the next question is okay, that is a repetition. So I will just skip that just to save time. And there's a comment from Rahul Pindi. Thank you so much for the great session once again. Sir, kindly ask about the best rhythm monitoring modality for a patient with an episode of unprovoked syncope who has history of same episode a year ago.
Yes, as I earlier mentioned, that it all depends on the type of syncope without any prodrome and frequency of syncope. As you have mentioned in your scenario, that it's an infrequent syncope. So whenever you are having unexplained, infrequent syncope, especially repetitive and with a duration of more than 1 year, then all these kinds of conventional rhythm monitoring tools like 24-hour event recorder, 30 days monitoring, they will not help you. In this scenario, they are actually assessing your knowledge between implantable loop recorder, invasive technique versus electrophysiological study. I want to clear your concept that if there is no clue on the ECG absolutely normal, without background of structural heart disease, electrophysiological study will not help. In this scenario, especially the duration is more than 1 year, and you have to correlate your symptoms with the rhythm, then implantable loop recorder will be the good choice. Prolonged monitoring tool.
Okay. The next question is, sir, device therapy, particularly type of permanent pacemaker that should be inserted in different scenarios is asked in theory as well as in the Viva. Where should we clear our concepts about this question?
Unfortunately, it's not mentioned in details in Brownwood. You can consult the Hearst somehow to poll and all the guidelines. And even if you have some, you can say questions where you are not clear, you can email us. You can share your concepts, or you can share your confusions in through our WhatsApp. We will try our best to help you, especially as far as the format of exam is concerned.
Great, great. That will be so nice. How will we define transient loss of consciousness?
So again, in the exam, transient loss of consciousness is a broader term. It will cover all your kinds of syncope. While syncope, suppose in transient loss of consciousness, uh, loss of cerebral hypoperfusion is one mechanism. But if the patient is having seizures, that's again come under the umbrella of transient loss of consciousness, that is secondary to primary dysfunction of cerebral cortex. So transient loss of consciousness is a broader term which will cover all kinds of neurally mediated vasovagal, or you can say cardiac or non-cardiac seizures, or all of these things. But syncope is a very, very brief term where you will get transient loss of consciousness, that's rapid with spontaneous recovery, and it's all about, and it's secondary to cerebral hypoperfusion, especially to your reticular activating system. So it has a different mechanism, and transient loss of consciousness has only one mechanism that will fulfill syncope, while it has many other mechanisms that will cover seizures and all those things that come under the umbrella of transient loss of consciousness.
Okay. A few comments we have. Very nice and wonderful session, sir. Very nice, informative session. Thanks to both organizer and the presenter. And the question is from Dr. Anila Afreen, and she's asking how to differentiate VVIR and dual chamber pacemaker
On
with
what?
A sense V pace rhythm on ECG.
A sense
V pace
and V.
rhythm on
Okay,
ECG.
okay. In the ECG, uh, there is only one indication of permanent pacemaker implantation, especially the VVI mode, that is chronic atrial fibrillation with slow ventricular response, permanent persistent atrial fibrillation with slow ventricular response. And you will not get the classical AV sequential pacing, even a sense and V pace in a background of VVI. So if you are having AV sequential pacing, then you have to keep the dual chamber permanent pacemaker in your differential rather than VVI. They will test your knowledge of VVI with, once they will give you the pacemaker syndrome in the background of AF, or the patient is having AV dissociation and V pace only, or regularized AF, the patient is having only V pacing. So this kind of the ECG you will come across in your exam, rather than they will give you AV sequential pacing on the ECG, and they will ask you what kind, what the mode the patient is, VVI or DDD, no, like that. In DDD, they can ask you DOO, DDI, or other things, rather than to differentiate VVI from DDD. I don't think so. They will ask you by giving AV sequential pacing. What do you think, Asim?
Sir, I agree with you. Totally agree with you. We have Dr. Mahesh. Okay, so Dr. Mahesh is actually his interventional cardiologist, assistant professor at NICVD, but he's always there to support us that all the candidates is very caring about them. And he's saying, excellent session. Thanks to Dr. Hasib and Dr. Mana. Thank you, Dr. Mahesh. Thank you so much for being there. Dr. Alia is saying very helpful. Thank you so much to both esteemed doctors. Thank you, Dr. Alia, for your nice comments. The question is, athletes having single syncope episode, when to resume competitive support?
So there is a separate section on athletes and sudden cardiac death. Agree, Dr. Hasib?
Agreed.
So
There's a
there
whole
are issues. There are issues regarding driving, okay, and they simply ask that the patient is having syncope in the background of athlete without knowing the mechanism. Again, it's a very high professional, you can say, question related to syncope without making the diagnosis of syncope. Suppose the patient is having channelopathy, ARVC, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. How there is a one-line answer where we can say that the patient is athlete, there is history of syncope, and after 3 to 6 months, the patient go and resume his support. I don't think so.
Okay, okay.
We
Dr.
have to
Imran,
we have to know the underlying substrate.
great, great. So Dr. Imran Salim is here and he's saying, great session. Thank you, Dr. Imran, for being here with us at
I
this.
think there should be some assignment to Dr. Imran Salim for next session.
Okay.
Sometimes I am too busy.
Okay.
Sometimes I'm really too busy, and
Yes, yes.
he has to cover the device tracings. He's a very good gentleman.
Yeah, yeah,
Really.
very nice, very nice, very nice. Why not? Why not? It will be a pleasure for me as well and very informative for the participants. Okay, so the question is, uh, thank you for such an informative session. Thank you, Dr. Manan, for having a webinar. What are the different common pacemakers, long case scenarios appearing in the exam, and how many permanent pacemaker cases do come in long cases?
There is one case in every day. So it means that's the reason I spared some time for this presentation, because we are sending patients. Sometimes they ask for CRTD, CRTP or ICD, we discourage. But at least as far as the long case of permanent pacemaker is concerned, you will definitely get. Any one of you will get the permanent pacemaker implantation case, especially in Lahore. I don't know in other centers. So as I mentioned, that even in my talk, I keep it a general. And in part 2, as I mentioned, then I'll share the stepwise approach of permanent pacemaker implantation long case. Uh, Meanwhile, if you have any queries, you just have to give your feedback, or you can send your questions to Dr. Hasib, that what are the questions which have been asked in the exam and how to answer. We will try our best to share all of you who have attended this webinar, that what are the possible viva questions that come across in the long case of permanent pacemaker implantation. So it's again a long discussion. It's again a long discussion.
Okay, we will do that, Dr. Manan. We will do that, inshallah. Dr. Sajid Ali, you know Dr. Sajid Ali. He is assistant professor of electrophysiology at NICVD Sakhar. He is also here, and he
He's
was
my best
listening to
friend.
you. Yeah. He likes you so much, also. So Dr. Sajid Ali is saying excellent presentation. Wow, that's great. That's great. Dr. Adnan is here. He's saying excellent webinar and very informative. Thank you, Dr. Adnan. And I think I have 2 or more questions left. Let's put the question. While passing temporary permanent, yes, okay, TPM. While passing TPM, if we have diaphragmatic contractions, what does it show? Number 1 question.
Sorry,
Whether
what's the
the
question?
lead, when we pass TPM, if we have diaphragmatic contractions, what does it show?
Then definitely there are two things. What's the amplitude of your generator? Second, what's the lead position? That's the key. You just have to change the lead just to avoid the diaphragmatic pulsation. Suppose normally we keep 2 to 3 volts of voltage for pacing, but if you are getting diaphragmatic pulsations even with a low pacing voltage, then it means that you have to reposition the TPM lead. And sometimes you have to use the fluoroscopy, because most of the time we are doing this procedure blindly in the emergency as the patient is having compromised hemodynamics. But you have to answer like this, that you have to reposition, and sometimes you have to use the fluoro, and then you can get some help by adjusting the voltage.
Okay, she has cleared the question more. Actually, she's asking whether the lead is in IVC and irritating diaphragm, or it happens when the TPM lead touches the inferior wall of RV.
Inferior wall of RV?
When the lead touches inferior wall of right ventricle, can we get diaphragmatic irritation?
Actually, in our experience, once we position, suppose once we position the RV lead of even permanent pacemaker implantation, whether that's in apical septum, that's in the true RV apex, we always check for diaphragmatic pulsations. Agree, Dr. Asif? It
Agreed, agreed.
means it means that if you are not in the mid septum, if you are not in the RVOT, then at any place, either in the RV apex, even in the apical septum, and like that, you can get these diaphragmatic pulsations. The only safe area is the RVOT, or sometimes the higher mid septum.
Okay. Dr. Sohail from Rawalpindi is saying, excellent session, sir. Please keep it up. Is there any specific share for permanent pacemaker ECGs in talks? Similarly for EP tracings? I will ask Dr. Manan because I know he's quite busy and taking care of the department. If this is possible, can we manage another webinar for just on the device tracings and EP tracings?
Oh yeah,
If
yes,
if
possible, possible.
if
Yes,
this is
possible.
possible, I would love to
Ah,
do
definitely, definitely.
because
So
because there are
we
3 to 4 people who have asked this multiple times. I think they need it.
Dr. Seep, actually what I feel that our candidates are very good in interpretation of echo, cath, but they are very weak in interpretation of ECG and device tracings and electrophysiological tracings, because
Agree.
they are not getting the systematic approach. They don't know the background concepts. They try to memorize rather than try to understand. So I think if I'll make a presentation, then I'll try my best to keep those tracings of devices and EP with clear understanding, with clear concepts. Whether you know one thing, but that should be clear to you, rather than to know 100 things and you don't have a clear concept. So I think if then we have to extend the duration of webinar, because if I'll share 15 to 20 tracings, then I'll discuss the systematic approach with pathophysiology and clear mechanisms, so that they have a good grip on those tracings, rather than just to say V sense, A sense, V pace, or like that. I don't think so.
I agree with
That
you,
will
Dr.
help.
Manan. I think I will contact you later and we will dig out something for them.
Yes. By keeping
Okay.
in view that what's the requirement of our candidates, what's the
Agreed.
stuff, and what's the percentage that have been asked in the exam. We will not touch the rare things. We will touch only the common things, because the time is very short and we are trying our best to help you, and especially the Dr. Asif. He's
थैंक यू सर थैंक यू सर आई एम ऑलवेज एक्चुअली सो अभी ये बातें मैं करना नहीं चाह रहा था लेकिन यू नो इट कि मैं जब मुल्तान था आई लुक फॉरवर्ड टू यू बिकॉज you have been the writer and you have been the teacher and those people who know you so when they talk they meet me they talk me they tell me कि आप में ना वो वाला टच नजर आता है वो जो लाहौर वाले जो है मैंने कहा हाँ ठीक है सही नजर आता है
no, 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 you are all my brothers, best colleagues. You are future.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Wakar here, excellent and very informative webinar. Dr. Khan is saying excellent session, sir. Dr. Naila, excellent presentation. Thanks a lot. And from Multan, Dr. Nasir Aji, my junior, I know him. Wonderful session and discussion. Bundle of thanks, sir, for your valuable time and giving us exam and practical tips. Question is from Dr. Khalik Sanawa. He's my senior, very dear to me from Multan. Types of cardiac monitor available in Pakistan.
Yes. Here, especially Punjab Institute of Cardiology, and I know some of the other institutions, they have conventional 24 to 7 to 2 hours Holter. They have event recorders. they have external loop recorders. Here we have implantable loop recorders. I think that's also true in NICVD and other centers. So it means that they can give you the tracings of implantable loop recorders and even the image, X-ray image of implantable loop recorders. And there are certain, you can say, devices with the name of LiveCore, which are directly record the rhythm, and you can connect yours with Android mobiles, very handy devices. And I just came to know that their cost is around $90 to $100. So practically, we have these kind of stuff for rhythm monitoring in Pakistan, and commonly we are getting the patients for Holter event external loop recorders, but sometimes we are using the implantable loop recorders, and they are wonderful, especially as Dr. Asi mentioned in one question, unexplained, infrequent syncope, atypical reflex syncope with normal heart, and where the patient is very keen to correlate the syncope with the rhythm. That's invasive device really help a lot to the patient. And these kinds of devices we have in Pakistan, but the others, especially the patches and the other handy devices, I don't think so they are available. Dr. Asif has experience in the NICVD. He can add something else.
I think there are a lot of things, and most of the things that we talk about are written in the guidelines, and practically we are not doing that. Very because of the cost issues and other issues and affordability. Most of the time, we are stuck with the affordability issue. Otherwise, we have the skills and we want to do everything. We have the patience also. But regarding the exam purpose, you must know which recorder and for which time duration, so that
Yes,
you
very,
can
very
answer the
important.
question appropriately. Okay, ji. So, Dr. Shah Mohammad Babar from NICUD, excellent PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Mannan. Dr. Hasib, very dedicated guy to keep it up. Thank you, Shah Babar. And Dr. Muhammad Rizwan from Jinnah Hospital, Lahore. Very informative session. Thanks a lot, sir. Okay, I think I'm going to take just last question, and then I will wrap up the session. Dr. Dayaram from, I think he's from Bahrain. Yes, due to some misunderstanding, I joined in the second half. Please do not forget to upload in MIC. Okay, I will try to upload it. It is a must. Excellent effort, Dr. Steve. Thank you, Dayaram. Although Dr. Hasib has covered ECG very well in his lectures, but we are never confident in solving pacemaker related ECGs. It will be a great idea, sir. Please do it. Sir, ये डॉक्टर मुनान आपके लिए है ये.
No, 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 definitely. We will go for. We will go for.
Uh, and this is the last comment that I am taking. Dr. Salih, बहुत सारे comments हैं. I'm taking the last one. Thank you so much, everyone. Dr. Salih Nazir from NICVD, excellent session. Special thanks for you. And okay, thank you, Dr. Salih. Thank you, sir. Dr. Manan, 2 to 3 minutes for you if you want to add something more for the participants for the webinar. Anything you want to say, sir, please.
Uh, I think in this COVID pandemic, I have special wishes for all of you. But I want to say that every candidate has its own format. You have to structure based on your knowledge by your own way. It's not, there is no a single book that will take you through the exam. It means every topic so that at the end it's really help you at how to revise and what are the main points. Otherwise, especially in the exam stress, I know it's very, very difficult to interpret, to answer accordingly. It's a time where you are free. You have to keep somebody with you that will give you the maximum stress, that will help you in the exam stress. I think that's the key.
Very great. Very nice. Very nice. So I would like to again thank you. हक तो ये है कि हक अदा ना हुआ, जितनी मर्जी मरतबा मैं थैंक्स कहता हूँ, लेकिन स्टिल आई वुड लाइक टू थैंक यू. जुबान जितना शुक्र अदा कर सकती है उतना तो चलो मैं करूँ ना. So thank you so much, Dr. Manan, for giving us your precious time and especially this great presentation. It is a lovely, I must say. और मुझे नज़र आ रहा है आपने कितनी मेहनत की होगी इसको बनाने में और कितना इंटीग्रेट किया आपने लॉन्ग केस के हवाले से इसको एक सिंपल प्रेजेंटेशन में सब कुछ समाने के लिए. इट इज़ अ ग्रेट एफर्ट, आई कैन अंडरस्टैंड. सो थैंक यू सो मच. I want to thank you from the panelists, from the participant side as well. They are very grateful to you for this presentation. सिंकपी को डिस्कस करना आसान काम नहीं है और बहुत से लोग सिंकपी को उस तरह से डिस्कस नहीं कर पाते जिस तरह से लॉन्ग केस आता है. So it was very very informative. And for the participants, thank you for joining us. जहाँ तक मुझे याद है हमने 140 तक का पार्टिसिपेंट्स का जो है ना वो नंबर हिट किया था जब मेरी नज़र पड़ी थी एक दफ़ा पार्टिसिपेंट्स के ऊपर. So we will see you in the next webinar, and I am planning for a power play of a webinar in the coming week. Do not miss it. And thank you so much, Dr. Manan, once again. Thank you so much, High Noon Pharma, for arranging everything, and Professor Dr. Zubair Akram Saab, always there for us. Sir, thank you so much. So see you next time, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.